Hi, and welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy. I am your host, Steve Bissell. I'm an author and mental health counselor. Are you curious about therapy? Do you feel there is a lot of mystery about therapy? Do you wonder what your therapist is doing and why? The goal of this podcast is to make therapy and psychology accessible to all by using real language and straight-to-the-point discussions. This podcast wants to remind you to take care of your mental health, just like you would your physical health. Therapy should not be intimidating. It should be a great way to better health. I will demystify what happens in counseling, discuss topics related to mental health, and discussions you can have with your therapist. I also want to introduce psychology in everyday life, as I feel most of our lives are enmeshed in psychology. I want to introduce the subtle and not so subtle ways psychology plays a factor in our lives. It will be my own mix of thoughts as well as special guests. So join me on this discovery of therapy and psychology. Hi, and welcome to episode 39, which is my favorite episode of the season. As I said before, it was hard to make a choice, but I had to make a choice, and I decided on Crystal Partney. Crystal talked about suicide, something that no one really talks about because it is a taboo subject. She talks about the loss of her sister to suicide, which is, again, a taboo subject, and she opens up in such a great way and talks about her mission that is so important to me and to her, obviously. So I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Crystal Partney is an author, speaker, and suicide grief coach and founder of Scattering Hope and Owl and Thistle. She's also the host of the upcoming You Are Loved podcast. After losing her sister on the day before her birthday from suicide, Crystal is hoping to continue to open the dialogue in regards to suicide and mental health in general. And I really hope that it goes well. A side story, I met Crystal online on one of those, Zoom meetings on something else. And then we met in San Diego by accident at a conference that we were both attending. And I really have enjoyed talking to Crystal during that time. And I'm hoping that that shows up in the interview. So here is the interview with Crystal. Hi, and welcome to episode 34 of Finding Your Way Through Therapy. It's interesting. You meet people differently throughout your career and your life. And I met Crystal online for the first time when we were going through a podcast kind of like thing with Steve Olsher. And then we went to I guess it was more of a get together. I don't know what to call it, but to get more information on how to get a podcast going. And we met in San Diego also for the first time face to face. And I just love Crystal's story. I just enjoyed it so much. So I wanted to invite Crystal to my podcast. So Crystal Partney, welcome.
Thank you.
Crystal, I don't want to share too much with the audience what I know about why I found it so interesting. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself at this point.
Sure. So my story really began the day before my birthday. In 2019, I received a phone call from my mother that morning that my sister Gina had taken her life. And after that, I just needed next steps. I didn't know how to begin to heal. I obviously have experienced tremendous loss in my life, but to lose someone to suicide was a whole new ballgame. And I honestly didn't know how to react. I didn't know how to process it. And it was such a shock, not just to me, but to my whole family in general. And that's really where my story begins.
What's your sister's name?
Gina.
And I'm very sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
It's one of the hardest things to do is to figure out suicide. It's such a thing that's very difficult to understand for so many people. Obviously, very shocking to lose your sister. Was she younger or older?
Yeah, she was my oldest sister.
And kind of like losing that older sister and then having right before your birthday.
Right.
Is just, how did you feel that day? I mean, how do you process that? How did this so difficult for so many people?
It wasn't easy, that's for sure. Like I said, when my mom called me, I was expecting her to, just ask me about my day, ask me about how, what I was planning for my birthday the next day. So to have her call wasn't anything unusual because we talk on the phone practically every day. So for her to call was nothing new. But as soon as I picked up the phone, I knew that something was terribly wrong because I could just hear it in her voice. She didn't even have to say anything. I could just feel it. And that day was just a complete whirlwind. My little girl was 3 at that time. Her birthday is the end of January. And so I was then faced with the difficult decision. How do I tell my 3-year-old that her Aunt Gina has died? Let alone, how do I explain to a 3-year-old about suicide? And what do I disclose? And how do I have that conversation with her because she's so little? And I felt like me and my husband handled it really well. And to be like fully transparent, we were just open. I didn't go into details, but it was just a beautiful moment that I shared with me and my daughter. And if you'd like, I'll share it with you.
Please do.
But yeah. So it was several days after my sister's passing. And I wrestled with the idea, as you can imagine, of telling her, okay, what do I share? How do I share it? And she knew something was up. And that's the beautiful thing about having kids that age is they're very much aware, they're very attuned to their surroundings. They know something has gone terribly wrong. They just don't know what. So I was in the bathroom and my little girl came in and she goes, "Mommy, why are you crying? You've been crying a lot. Why have you been crying?" And so without, talking to my husband first, but I, inadvertently said, "Hey, we need to say something to her." So I just took that moment and said, "Honey, I've been crying because, Aunt Gina has died." And she looked at me and she goes, "Why?" And I said, "Well, honey, I don't know why." I said, "She was just really sad." And then it's so interesting because she then looked at me and she started to smile. And I said to her, literally, "Honey, why are you smiling?" And she goes, "Well, does that mean she's with Grandpa Lenny?" And that's my dad.
Hmm.
And she never got the opportunity to meet my dad, but because he passed away before she was born. But we talk about him all the time. And so she goes, does that mean she's with Grandpa Lenny?" And I said, "Yes, honey." And she says, "Okay." And she ran out of the bathroom. And it was kind of comical because it was like, oh, that went better than I expected. Not that I could plan for these things, but it was like, oh, she handled that far better than I anticipated. And for her, that's all she needed. It was just so much comfort and peace to me at that moment that it was like, oh, okay, so she doesn't need to know the details. She just needs to know that she's in good company, that
Right.
she's with, my dad and other loved ones that have passed on. And that's enough for her. And that should be enough for me. And of course, like all of us are tremendously sad, but to have it be vocalized from a 3-year-old, it was like, oh, okay, I get it. I get it. And it was beautiful.
I have a tear in my eye just listening to your story. And it's a little bit of the stuff that I think is so important for so many people. Having some sort of spiritual life, whatever that is. And again, whether it's, with your father or whatever spiritual life people believe in, which is fine. I always tell people how important spiritual life is to your own mental health and how to deal with difficulties. Because if you not having a spiritual life is probably the most difficult thing to not have when you're going through a whole lot. I know that we're going to be shifting a little bit here, but you talked about how your daughter dealt with it, and you did brilliant as a parent. I got to tell you.
Oh, thanks. That was planned. No, not really.
Yeah, you read the book on it. I'm assuming.
Of course.
The book that came out, when she was born, there's a manual and all that stuff,
Right,
right?
exactly. That manual was fabulous, by the way.
Yes, if I can get my hands on it, please let me know. But I wonder how also for you as you lose your sister, and how did you deal with all that? Because not only is it hard because you have a young daughter, but it's also dealing with your own loss because it's your sister.
Yeah. Well, like I have shared just a minute ago, it wasn't easy. I was literally graduating. I was in my senior year of college, about a month away from graduating. So,
Wow.
as you can imagine, not that there's any perfect timing to hear this tragedy, but it came at such a time where I was like, oh my goodness, okay, now I'm faced with the decision, do I even graduate? And I really had to sit with that and say, what would my sister want for me in this moment? And my sister knew like the, blood, sweat, and tears of just getting to that point where it was like, okay, I see that I'm graduating in a month. And I had to just ask. And I honestly, I had to ask her too, and just ask her verbally and just say, Gina, what would you want? I know you would want me to graduate. Is this what you want? And it was a definite yes. Like, I want you to graduate. And then you can work out the details later. And so that's what I did. I was very fortunate to graduate. And it didn't matter about grades at that point. I just graduated.
I bet.
And I told myself that I was going to take a year off, and I was very fortunate. I didn't have to like rush out and find a job in the field that I had just graduated. I could really, just take my time and just heal. And so that's what I did. But it's interestingly enough, we talked about the spiritual aspect of it. After it hit me and we went on a graduation trip to San Diego, of all places, actually. And my mom and my husband and daughter, we all celebrated, and I wanted my mom to come, and she did, and we had a fabulous time. And but I got to be honest, that's really when it hit me that my sister was gone, because I felt like up until that point, you're just going through the motions and you're just like, graduate, graduate, graduate.
Right.
And, turn in this paper, do this test, go to work. I'll fill all the
And be
blanks.
a
And
mom.
then when we were on my trip, it was like the noise just got stopped and it was quiet. And that's when it was like, oh wow, okay, this is real. This is real and raw too. And not, again, just not just for me, but for my whole family, for my mom. And it was extremely difficult. And I want to always tell people that that first year, you've got to be able to ebb and flow. You can't go at the pace that you were going at before, and you can't continuously like beat yourself up over what has happened, because it's so easy to get in your head and be like, well, I could have done this or I should have done this. And you really have to take a stand back and say, I did the best I could with the circumstance. I did the best I could with where I was at. And I have to give myself grace because at the end of the day, again, I keep referring back to my sister because I'm constantly asking her, like, okay, Gina, I know that you would not want me to keep reminiscing and holding this unattainable like standard to myself. She would want me to begin healing, whatever that looked like for me. And just again, bringing that grace into your life is so key.
Well, I think that when you go through the grieving process, there's Kubler Ross's stages of grief that everyone knows about. And as some people have said it's been debunked. I don't necessarily agree with that. I do believe there's no order to it. I mean, the disbelief, the depression, the anger, the bargaining, and the acceptance, they happen in different,
Right. They
and they
happen in waves.
and they'll happen again over and over. I think until we pass away, frankly, because it's, you can accept something. That doesn't mean the anger is taken care of. I don't think that the bargaining is taken care of necessarily. We still think about these things and they ebb and flow. I think that's great advice for the first year. Just being able to adapt is, and respecting yourself. I mean, therapists and a lot of people talk about self care, but being able to be just caring for yourself. I mean, there's a difference between the two, in my opinion. Being able to care for yourself and giving yourself a break is so important. So I think that that's where you did really good with the ebb and flow. And I really like the, how it hit you at a different time. We're talking about what, a 4-month period that it hit you?
Yeah, I would say, definitely within, after graduating and then after the date, we immediately went on vacation. And it was that period of vacation and winding down and coming back from the vacation. That's really, I would say, yeah, that's pretty accurate. The 4 month span, but again, it was a continuum. It wasn't like, hey, I'm good. But it's interesting because everybody's journey is unique in the healing process and the grieving process, because I have family members that they just immediately went back to work and it was like no big deal. But I knew that they were hurting. They just had a different way of showing it. And so again, it's so personal and there's no right or wrong way, but as long as you begin, because it's so easy to just push it off and be like, nope, I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to, I'm fine. The classic phrase, I'm fine. It's like, uh, bull crap. You're
Right.
not fine. But that's okay. If that's the front you want to put up, that's your choice. But I would just encourage anybody that if they're in that situation and they find themselves wanting to push it off because it is hard and it is difficult and it's going to bring up a wave of emotions, to learn to embrace it rather than resist it. Because in the moments when I did resist it, oh my goodness, Steve, it came back like tenfold. And can I just say that the least opportune moment, like, oh, I'm at the grocery store and I'm like sobbing in the cereal aisle. Not the best time, but hey.
Yeah. And unfortunately, we don't have any control over that either.
No.
So, just a reminder, we're listening to Finding Your Way Through Therapy. I'm sitting here with Crystal Partney. My name is Steve Biso. One of the things that I think we related to so many different things off air, obviously, and want to say, having lost my best friend when I was 12 and really not processing it till I was 16. It was a weird situation for me to deal with that. 1980s, much different time than today. So obviously that's giving away my age. Therapy wasn't offered to me, obviously. And that's not because anyone is bad. It wasn't the zeitgeist of the times. We didn't really think about that stuff. Did you end up going to counseling, going to therapy or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that was one of the requests that my mother had, was as soon as this tragedy occurred, we as a family decided, okay, me and my other sister decided, okay, now is the time that mom really needs to begin to process this and go to therapy. We had encouraged her to go long before my sister's passing, but when, my dad passed away, and we were encouraging her then, and for whatever reason it didn't happen. And then when my sister had passed away, it was like, okay, no, this is the final straw. Like, we need you to go. And she very lovingly asked if I would go with her. She said, I'll go, but I want you to go with me. And I said, that's fine. I will go. And to be fully transparent, we still go. We still go even to this day. And it's not obviously as frequently as it was in the beginning, but I've found it tremendously helpful because there was this third party that could speak into our story and speak into the problems that we were having, the circumstances. and just in general. And it's interesting because when I reached out to this therapist that was referred to us, I I kind of felt like, well, in my mind, this tragedy has already occurred, so it's too late. And it was just interesting because the therapist was like, "No, like, I need you in here next week." Like, they were very adamant, like, "No, I need you in here next week. Like, can you come next week? Great." And it just kind of threw me off guard because in my mind, it was like, well, it was too late, but not understanding, no, it's never too late. And that, having someone to be adamant and saying, "No, like, now is the perfect time, and let's get it started. Let's have you begin that healing process." And having therapy as again, it's like a tool belt, right? You're having another tool that you can refer to that is only going to help you, and it's for your benefit. I know that there's such a stigma there, but there really shouldn't be. And I don't know why, but yeah,
Well, I think that we're still dealing with a whole lot of history in westernized cultures and in America about something bad happened. Get your shit together and get back into whatever you're doing. You
right.
know,
It's,
the
yeah,
ba- the
go
bear.
back to work, do whatever, distract yourself. Yeah, yeah.
It's called burying it. Come on, let's go. And I think that that's why, like, one of the biggest things that bereavement process is so important, in my opinion, is to, as you said, and I'm going to say in the therapeutic way, I think that's just validating where you're at and being okay. I mean, you always feel strange because you're like, okay, I'm kind of feeling blank, but you feel strange. So the bereavement process with a family therapy or even an individual therapy is really helpful to be validated for how you feel. And I don't know how you feel about that.
Oh, absolutely. Because it's interesting because my mom would share something in therapy session and then the therapist would say, "Well, is that true?" Because we we tend to be like, "Oh yeah, it's this way," but so it's pretty comical. It's like, "Okay, is that true?" And it's like, "Well, yeah, that's true," or "Nope." you know. So it's nice to have a family member there too to just process everything. And me and my mom have always been really close, and we were extremely close to my sister. And my sister, lived with my mother and in the basement of my mom and dad's home. And so to say that they were close was, of course, of course
Right.
they were close.
I'm just a big fan of therapy, obviously, as I do that for a living. But I also think that when you go through therapy, did you feel yourself any type of stigma for going to therapy for the loss of your sister? Like you said, I think the words were, well, the tragedy already occurred. Why go to therapy? Was there a stigma that came in with that for you?
Oh, absolutely. Because again, suicide in general holds its own stigma. And
100%.
then you're trying to, grapple with what has happened and what has already occurred. And of course, like I had to deal with that in my own regard and just say, like, Crystal, this is for my benefit. This is for your benefit. And what I also realized too, when I had to share with my daughter that, Aunt Gina has died, I realized in that moment, Steve, that it wasn't just me, that I had a 3-year-old that was looking to me in this very moment for that whenever she experiences a tragedy in her life, she's going to remember this moment and she's going to ask herself, well, how did mom handle it? Was she like a wreck? Was she, strong? Did she ask for help? Did she receive help? That was the key because I gotta be honest, I very struggled with like receiving the help from whether it was my husband or my daughter or outside other family members or friends. That was a struggle for me. But I just realized in that moment that, okay, this isn't about just me, but she's going to remember this and how I processed it. And I'm setting the bar for her so that whenever she does experience a tragedy, she's going to refer to this moment. And notice I'm saying when, not if.
You don't think it's all over and you'll never have a tragedy until the end of your life?
Right. Wishful thinking, but no.
But I think that's good. I mean, you said it yourself. Modeling the behavior is so important, and also kind of like saying that this is going to happen again. I think that there's a lot of people who like to think that this one tragedy, and it's not going to be one tragedy. We all have losses. I mean, in life, that's just how it is, and knowing how to process it and feeling everything you said. My daughter, did I bury it? Did I deny it? Did I deal with it? Did I go to therapy? Did I talk to her? I think it's not just one of those things, it's all of those things need to be addressed. And I think that therapy really helps with that. Just a final question. What do you think was the most helpful that your therapist did other than say, well, is that true? I mean, is there other things that you felt that the therapist really did well for you?
Yeah, I would say one of the things that they continue to do is press further because it's easy for me and for, my mom too, to kind of give like the blanket statement or the story, but then to dig a little bit deeper and ask more questions was extremely helpful and is extremely helpful to the therapy process because again not realizing like hey there's some underlining things that as I'm sharing just different stories or whatever the case may be, whether it's a conflict, there's always more to it. And so just having our therapist, press a little bit further, even when it's hard, and just be willing to ask more questions and dive a little deeper.
Therapy is not necessarily comfortable. If it's too comfortable, it's probably not good. I push my clients regularly, and I always share this story. My former therapist, when I first met her, I did like 15 minutes with her, and she looked at me after 15 minutes. She's like, all right, now that you've said all your therapist bullshit, are you going to tell me the real truth? And I remember going, wow, she called me right away on my stuff. And she gained my absolute respect. And I know that some people, I share that story when people feel uncomfortable about therapy and I say it's okay to be uncomfortable in therapy. That's what it should be.
Yeah,
And maybe that's part of the stigma. But for me, it's like, let's lift the stigma by saying, yeah, it should be uncomfortable. You go to PT, it's not going to be comfortable. You're working back your way to different things.
right.
So mental health's the same way. Let's shift gears a little bit because I really want to know more about what are your thoughts because you've been through your own therapy, you went through your loss. This is so difficult, especially losing your sister Gina. What would you tell someone after losing a loved one to suicide? What would be your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are just there's always hope. I know that, especially for me, I felt alone and just trying to process it, even though I knew like mentally I'm not alone, but there was just this void that was missing. And quite frankly, I don't think will ever be filled because she took a piece of my heart. And so, but there's always hope. And you don't need a lot of it, you only need a sliver of it. And I know that there are going to be really, really dark days ahead of you. And just know that when you're in those moments, to look for the signs that they're there with you because one of the moments that was so profound was it was actually before my sister passed away. It was the Christmas that I shared with my family after my dad passed away. He passed away in April of 2013, and it was Christmas, and there that was just a really tough year for me. I kind of coined that my year of hell because in January, I lost a nephew at 39 weeks gestation. And
Jeez.
then I lost my dad in April due to health complications. And then I lost my best friend. in December of that year to the same health complications. And I remember that Christmas and just just sitting there mad. I was so mad. And I remember yelling and just being like, "You guys should be here right now.
Mhm.
You should be here." And I was extremely sad. And I gotta say, it was such a, I felt this peace come over me. And all is, the whisper only said was, "Crystal, we're here. We're just not in the form that you want us to be in." And it was like, "Oh, you're right. I want you to be here physically." But in that moment, I realized they're still here. They're experiencing life with you. Make no mistake of it. They are here. They are with you in the ups. They are with you in the downs. And they're not going anywhere. And just, it brought me so much peace in that moment. And yes, of course, I was still mad. I was extremely sad, but it was like, "Oh, okay, you're right. You're right. I want you here physically, but you're not. But again, y- you're still here. I just can't see you, but you're experiencing life with me." And I, it's kind of interesting because I always joke. I tell my sister, I'm like, "Okay, Gina, you're more than welcome to hang out with me, but I'm kind of boring. And if you're okay with that, then, then you're more than welcome to stay." So I'm glad I can still, give her a laugh and she can give me a laugh. But
I'm pretty sure she
it,
doesn't find you boring.
yeah, I hope not.
It's hard when someone, especially with suicide, it's so hard to understand. You had all that loss in 2013. I kind of remind people that we carry everyone's, whether you want to call it your heart, your brain, whatever, it doesn't really matter to me. I carry all the ones that I've lost through in my heart and in spiritual ways in through everything. So it is maddening. It is sad. It creates fear. There's so many emotions that go with that, and just kind of normalizing that fact and losing someone to suicide. I wish I had a better explanation for any human being that comes through to my door or anyone who tells me about it. I don't have an explanation. I don't think anyone has an explanation. And it's realizing that all you can do is carry their in your heart, in your soul, in your spiritual life, you carry them with you. And I think that's a powerful statement you just made.
Thank you. Yeah. And we all search for answers. And I know, especially with my sister, there was a letter, but I felt like, and I'm sure it's not just me, but my whole family, even though there were her, it's in her words, and this was her, reasons, it doesn't make it any better. And so again, just using the constant reminder that they're here, that there's nothing that they will say will bring peace to your spirit, if that makes sense.
I think that peace all comes from within. I mean,
Yeah.
I did not know Gina, but obviously I think that she is in our interview right now. She may not, whether people think that's too woo woo for them, I don't really care. I think she's right here. She's part of you. She's part of our conversation. I'm happy to share that with the world too. So I'm happy that you're continuing to share her legacy and everything else with that. And we'll definitely get to that too. Why do you feel there's still a stigma around suicide, mental health, and all that stuff that's still going on and still prevalent across a lot of different places in this world right now?
Well, like we had shared earlier, death in general is hard to process. But then you throw the word suicide in the mix, and it's like, wow, okay. It just adds a whole another layer and complexity to the situation and the loss. And how I processed my sister's loss, it was different compared to my dad. And as it should be. Like, I just want to
Right.
preface that by saying our relationship, our dynamics, vastly different between both people. And that's okay. That's normal. So, why I think there's a stigma is there's the only thing that comes to my mind is fear. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of, well, I got to have all the answers. And if I don't have all the answers, I'm going to look like a fool rather than
Right.
embracing that and saying, well, nobody has all the answers. And that's a good thing. That means you're open, you're willing to, going back and receive the help. And you're willing to say, hey, I'm not perfect and I don't know what I'm doing. And so there's a level of honesty that comes alongside and helping break that stigma and saying, you know what, I need some help. I need some help. And I got to be honest, like, even my sister was seeing a therapist and she was prescribed medication and then comes to find out that she stopped taking the medication. She stopped going to therapy. And I remember her vocalizing and saying, like, it's just not working. It's not working. I don't want to, spend the money. It's just not working. And I remember telling her, I was like, well, Gina, go find someone else. I was
Right.
like, yeah, maybe that person's not great. So find someone else. As simplistic as that was, but you also have to be willing to accept the help.
Right.
You have to be able to say, especially to those people that you love, hey, I'm not well. This is going on and these things that keep coming up and I really could use some help. And as a family, we were desperately trying to get my sister the help that she needed. And just she was unwilling to receive it at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I mean, just a reminder, we're listening to Finding Your Way Through Therapy. Crystal Partney, Steve Bisson here. One of the things that it never really took me a long time, but I know some therapists have struggles with this. One of my first things I say when I meet new clients is, listen, I'm not everyone's cup of tea. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. The good news is there's a ton of other therapists that you can be referred to. So you don't like my style or what have you. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. We'll try to find you someone that may be a better style, better fit, whatever the case may be. But I think there's also stigma around that too, because now I got to repeat my story and this and that. Well, maybe because you tell your story, you're taking away, I'm going to bore you with neurological stuff here, but we have anywhere from 30,000 to 50,000 thoughts in a day. And they stay in your head and they're going to be all muffled and all screwed up. And a lot of the moments of aha in my therapy sessions are people just saying out loud what they're thinking. And they're like, oh, wow, that makes perfect sense. Oh, wow, why was I even thinking that? Or what have you. But it just sometimes that insight, you need to have that third party who's only vested in you to listen to you and kind of validate and or just listen to you. So I always encourage therapy for that way, but I think that it's hard sometimes to open up. And like I said, my therapist would have told you the same thing about me. But hey, confidentiality, we can't talk about it. The hardest part for me too, as a therapist, even though obviously I've worked with people who've had suicide in their life, I've certainly lost clients to suicide. It's hard to kind of start addressing that. And how do you bring that up? Maybe not even in therapy, but how do you bring that up to anyone? How do you talk about that stuff?
For me, again, I have a lot of stories, but I realized just how important it was even before my sister passed away. So I'll just share this brief example of how to begin talking about something as sensitive as suicide and if people are contemplating suicide. So my sister, she, was newly divorced and her children were in their teenage years and they wanted to only live with their dad. which he doesn't live nearby. He lives about 3 hours away. And so my sister was a single mom, and she would, rarely see the kids. And when she would see the kids, typical teenagers, they'd be on their phones and they wouldn't really be present. And I know that that was a source of contention for my sister. Like, and I get it, she's like, gosh, I don't understand. Like, I just want them to be present, or I want them to do XYZ. And they're not. They'd rather hang out with their friends. But I bring that up because so my sister, she was newly divorced, and we were celebrating Christmas, and I was out Christmas shopping for my family, and I knew my sister was struggling. And I came across this beautiful wooden sign. And as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh my gosh, I have to get that for Gina. And so I did. And for those of you that don't know, I come from a very large family. I'm the youngest of eight. And so, as you can imagine, there's no way I can buy Christmas gifts for all of my family members, let alone their spouses and their kids, and anybody would go broke. I'm
Right.
just saying. But I saw this and I was like, yep, I need to get this for Gina. So I got home, and it was just right before Christmas. And I went over to my mom and dad's home, and I went downstairs in the basement, and I said, Gina, I got you a Christmas gift. And she was like, what? You got me a Christmas gift? And I was like, yes, I know. It's not our thing because, it's not in the budget or whatever, but I got you this because I thought of you as soon as I saw it. And she unwrapped it and she started to cry. And the sign, the wooden sign, what it says on it is find your happy.
Hmm.
And I took that moment and I just looked at her and said, Gina, I don't know what you're going through. And I just wanted to let you know that I see you. I see you. I see the struggles you're going through. And I don't know what it's like to be newly divorced and have your kids choose to live 3 hours away. I don't know what that's like. And I can't even imagine what it's like as a mother to have that decision be placed on you. And, just the notion of starting over again, and after, decades of being married, and I don't know what that's like, but I just wanted to let you know that I see you, and I truly do want you to find your happy. And like I said, in that moment she was crying, and I think that was the realization for me that it's as simple as that. Just simply having the conversation with the people that we care and love about, and care about, and just saying, I see you. I see the struggles you're going through. And even if they're not visually, like, I could see the struggles that my sister was going through. And oftentimes they keep it hidden. But just simply having the conversation with them and just say, you know what, we haven't talked in so long, and I just want to check in and see how you're doing, and tell me how you're doing, tell me about your day, and just begin that conversation. And you might have to be blunt and say, I gotta ask a very sensitive question, but have you ever thought of taking your life? And if they're like yes, or if they're not going to be open, it's fine. But just the fact that you're willing to have that conversation with someone can speak volumes. And especially what I realized in that moment with my sister was, oh my goodness, all it takes is a conversation. And it doesn't have to be difficult. It doesn't even have to be uncomfortable. It can just be as simple as saying that I see you and I love you.
And sometimes people who are in that suicidal thought process, they just don't feel love. They feel alone. One of the things that the biggest thing I learned when I started my career, I worked on a crisis team, is that in fact, asking about suicide creates a situation where they're less likely to commit suicide because you brought it up. Most people are like, no, you gave them the idea. No, they probably already had the idea. So might as well just put it out there and kind of like be able to have that hard conversation. Not an easy thing to do, but you're absolutely right. You got to bring it up.
Well, and it becomes this sort of breath of fresh air. Like, oh, okay. I was like struggling with this all internally. And the fact that you just came out and said it, it's just asked, like, oh, okay.
Right. And you need to ask, I think, and it's such a difficult thing to do. Um, Approaching our loved ones with those thoughts and those conversations probably shows more care than not bringing it up.
Right.
So, do you suggest any other ways of bringing it up to someone? Just kind of like being as honest, or do you have any other ideas around that?
Yeah, especially when it comes to like teenagers. I was, thinking about this and even after experiencing this beautiful moment with my sister and just realizing like, okay, we're just going to have the conversation and just even, taking them out to dinner or whatever it is that you guys like to do together and just have the conversation and just be willing to say, have you ever thought about this? And if so, like just be open. And just the fact that you're willing to have the conversation with them is going to be such a breath of fresh air for them and for you because quite frankly, I didn't realize this until recently, but when I growing up like talking about suicide, it was kind of uncommon. And maybe it was just because I didn't experience that until I was, around 16. I lost a childhood friend
The
to suicide.
aforementioned stigma was real and continues to be real. So please continue. I'm sorry. I just had to say
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And so for me, it was like, oh, okay. But what I realized recently was that that's not true now. Now you have teenagers that have lost friends to suicide because it is more on the uptick, if you will. And it was just like, oh my gosh, it becomes even more important that we have these conversations with our teenagers, with our children, and saying, hey, I've noticed that you've been really distant lately. Tell me what's up. What's going on? And they may or may not open up to you. But again, just having that conversation with them, be willing to have the conversation with them because
Right.
it's so easy to be like, oh, not my kid. No, my kid's good, but it's often the most saddest words that you will ever hear is we had no idea.
Right. And I think that we can vilify social media or we can celebrate it. I like to decide to do both. But with social media, they do encounter more experiences with people committing suicide or losing their life. I think that giving a little bit of credit for the overall media, whether it's print, radio, TV, or online, where they talk about people dying of suicide, where in the past it would be that someone died tragically, and the only people who died of suicide were like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a name. When I grew up was Kurt Cobain. That was the only one they really talked about openly, how he passed away. But now it's kind of like all over the place. And in some ways, social media may have helped kind of lift a little bit of that stigma and be able to talk about it so that teenagers are aware. And then us as parents, as people, frankly, I say parents, but frankly, people, I mean, we need to be able to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the idea that you bring up Kurt Cobain because again, I just naturally assuming that and remembering like, yeah, you're right. I don't recall any other, even if it's a celebrity, but I don't recall ever just having that specific conversation. Like this person died by suicide. It was like, oh, okay, because it just wasn't talked about. And again, there's no right or wrong. It was just how it was. And But now that we're seeing this dramatic uptick, we need to start having that conversation and not be fearful about it. And yes, it's going to be uncomfortable, but would you rather the alternative?
Yeah, exactly. It was, you took the words out of my mouth. And it's one of those things that I feel like no matter what you feel about the pandemic, it has created more social isolation in general and feeling alone. And unfortunately, we've polarized ourselves. You're against blank or you're for blank. I'm just not getting into that debate right now. And so I think that because of increased isolation, I think suicide has increased overall. And I think that we need to be able to talk about it. This is not over. Even if the pandemic tomorrow miraculously was done and tomorrow, I still think that we're going to deal with the ramification for years to come. And that includes suicidal thoughts.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting because we've been talking for about an hour already and we flew by. First of all, I want to thank you because I know you said you mentioned me in some work that you had written. So I do want to thank you for that. But I think that a lot of people will want to communicate with you and talk about you. So tell me a little bit about how we can reach you and how are you presenting in this world right now?
Thank you. Yeah, and my pleasure, Steve. I'm happy to support you in any way that I can, and I know that it'll be reciprocated. But you can find me my social media at scatteringhope.com, my website, or across social media at Scattering Hope, as well as the sister company that I started in my sister's memory is Owl and Thistle. And same thing, alanthistle.com and across social media, Alan Thistle. And the goal, the mission behind Alan Thistle is to do exactly what we've been talking about here on the end of our conversation. And that is allowing people the space to have that conversation, but also to let people know in our life how much they are loved.
Well, I went to your website and, there's a subscription box, I believe.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Of course. Yeah. So, like I was just mentioning, both parties, both companies have their distinct flavor, if you will. The Scattered Hope focuses on helping families heal after losing a loved one to suicide, and the sister company, Owl and Thistle, is focused on suicide prevention and letting people know how much they are loved. And so each subscription has different products inside that are, of course, tailored to whether it's healing after the suicide loss or allowing people the opportunity to have that conversation with our loved ones and saying, hey, I see you. And I just wanted to let you know that I'm thinking about you and I love you. And just opening up that conversation and having that dialogue. And both subscription boxes allow someone to do that.
Well, I think it's a brilliant idea, first of all.
Oh, thank
When I
you.
saw that, it was a great idea. And I can't thank you enough, not only for today, but for what I consider a good friendship. Since we started knowing each other, we've had hard conversations. I wanted to kind of like share the when we were in San Diego, we started having a conversation a little bit about your sister. It was a little hard and you have to walk away, which is very much fine. But sometimes you meet people in your life that we're geographically far from each other. I mean, and you meet someone and you just kind of like feel like you know them and you feel really close to them. So I can't thank you enough for what I consider a good friendship so far and really sharing your story so openly everywhere I've met you. I think it's going to open a lot of minds. So I appreciate
Oh, thank you, Steve. And I've really enjoyed our blossoming friendship as well. I know that the universe works in magical ways. And it was interesting that you brought up San Diego because I think both of us, neither one of us had any idea that we were going to be in San Diego at that same time, let alone be able to meet each other face to face. So it was definitely one of those moments where it was like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. What a small world that we were able to correspond with each other right before and then unknowingly meet each other face to face in San Diego. It was such a beautiful moment. So thank you.
It was funny because I'm like, I was sitting in the other table. You were sitting at the other table, and I heard your name. That's Crystal, I'm pretty sure. And I kind of brought it up, and you're like, yeah, that. Oh, and then we had that connection. It was just an awesome moment that I will cherish for a long time because it's always those things that mean the most, I think, in life. It's those accidental moments, not the ones you planned.
Yes, absolutely. And just like we were talking about throughout this whole conversation is that there's going to be people that you meet that you had no idea that you can help and support down the road. And it's just be open. And I'm so grateful that I got the chance to meet you.
Well, and I know that you're working on a podcast eventually. I know that dealing with pregnancy and starting a podcast can be sometimes very difficult. But, if you ever want a guest on, it will be my pleasure to be on with you.
Absolutely. Yes, I'd love to have you.
So I thank you very much for your time. And I know we will talk soon.
I know we will too. Thank you.
Well, that concludes episode 39. Thank you so much, Crystal Partney. Again, probably one of my favorite episodes talking about very difficult subjects. And she opened up, and I can't tell you how important it is to me. Me and Crystal will be doing some projects together in the near future, and I will keep you updated via my social media as well as my newsletter. So please subscribe as much as you need. Episode 40 will be a returning guest for the fourth time in fourth season, Sergeant J. Ball. He's going to be accompanied by Caitlin Dehe, who is also a returning guest. And we're going to talk again about first responders, mental health, and hopefully we can even talk about firefighters and EMTs and paramedics. So I hope you join us for episode 40 and debut episode of season 4. So please join us. Please like, subscribe, or follow this podcast on your favorite platform. A glowing review is always helpful. And as a reminder, this podcast is for information, educational, and entertainment purposes. If you are struggling with a mental health or substance abuse issue, please reach out to a professional counselor or therapist for consultation.